I'm Andrea Bayer, curator in the Department of European Paintings, and I'm delighted that you're all here for this Sunday at the Met. It's been organized to celebrate two important acquisitions that were made last year of works by the Florentine artist Perino del Vaga, who came of age in Raphael's workshop in Rome between about 15, 17, and 20, and went on to dominate the artistic scene in Rome and Genoa in the following decades. By pure serendipity, a previously unknown and exceedingly rare painting of the Holy Family with the infant St. John of about 1525, and a major presentation drawing of Jupiter and Juno done for a tapestry designed for the Genoese prince Andrea Doria 5 years later, were to be sold at auction at 1 day apart. The director and trustees decided that neither could be passed over, and with a stroke of good fortune, we were successful in acquiring both. Following the conservation of the painting, we mounted a focus exhibition that's currently on view in the Lehman Wing and was curated by Linda Wolk-Simon, one of our speakers today. We hope that you'll go and see it if you haven't done so already. It includes all of Perino's marvelous drawings in New York collections, as well as one other painting by the artist, also from a New York private collection. When the exhibition closes, the painting will hang in our High Renaissance Gallery. That is alongside our Raphael Colonna altarpiece, the Andrea del Sarto Borgherini Holy Family, and the Bronzino Portrait of a Man, some of our greatest treasures. This is, in fact, the first time that we've been able to add a painting of the first rank to that gallery since the Havemeyer's bequest in 1929 of the Bronzino. Both painting and drawing make clear Perino's supreme gifts of invenzione, invention, as well as the subtlety of his mind, as he explored the lessons that he learned from Raphael and then used his unique talents to push his style into the direction we now call mannerism. The talks today are meant to bring you deeper into Perino's world, that of Rome in the tumultuous decade of the 1520s, the distinctive culture of Genoa in the following decade, and then the grand panorama of 1540s Rome, where Perino had his greatest success under the papacy of Paul III. We hope that they will enrich the context of the works now on view, and above all, introduce you to two important additions to the Metropolitan's collections of Italian Renaissance art. Our first speaker, Linda Wolk-Simon, will be known to many of you from her years working at the Metropolitan Museum, first in the Lehman collection, and then as a curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints. While at the Met, she worked on many exhibitions and publications, some, I'm delighted to say, with me, including Art and Love in Renaissance Italy in 2008-9, Raphael at the Metropolitan, the Colonna altarpiece, whose catalog won an Association of Art Museum Curator Award in 2006, Domenico Tiepolo, Drawings, Prints, and Paintings in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, 1996, and 16th Century Italian Drawings in New York Collections in 1994. But before any of this, Dr. Wolk-Simon studied the art of Perino del Vaga, completing a dissertation on the artist for the University of Michigan and publishing, by my count, some 13 articles, reviews, and groups of entries having to do with the complex Florentine artist over these years. As Linda is fond of saying, Perino is a household name in her household. It is in good part thanks to Linda's perspicuity that we were emboldened to pursue the Holy Family currently on view in the Lehman Wing, which she has now published in the Burlington Magazine. And her input was a major factor in the purchase of the great drawing for a tapestry on view there as well. As of earlier this year, Linda has moved to the Morgan Library and Museum, where we are proud to see her as the Charles W. Engelhard Curator and Department Head, Drawings and Prints. Today, her talk is titled, In the Shadow of Raphael, the Life and Art of Perino del Vaga. Please welcome Linda Wolk-Simon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. You stole my punchline. So in return, I'll confess that I'm not talking about general or late Rome at all, and I'm talking about a very brief 3 or 4 year period in Perino's very, very early career. So maybe we can have a second day of Perino lectures to talk about Genoa and Rome. Before I begin, I just really would like to express my sincere thanks to Andrea, not only for organizing the lectures today, inviting me to speak, but to her and Keith Christensen and Michael Gallagher here at the Metropolitan for the protracted, lengthy conversations we had over many weeks and months about the new acquisitions, particularly with Michael in the Conservation Lab looking at the new painting as it emerged from its own shadow to become, I think, really a glorious masterpiece, a very rare work by the artist who is a household name in my house. And my lecture, because I can never get away from Raphael, it's also really a lot about Raphael with who I begin. As the supreme paradigm of the classical ideal, Raphael's art was exalted for over 3 centuries. His example emulated, appropriated, imitated, and eventually parodied by the likes of Poussin on the left, Ingres at the upper right, Manet, the lower left, quoting an invention of Raphael's at the right, not to mention hordes of anonymous jokesters. As a mythic archetype, Raphael, the Prince of Painters, loomed in the collective artistic and cultural imagination for much of the 16th century, beginning from the moment of his sudden and unanticipated death, Christ-like, on Good Friday in April 1520. So great in magnitude and anagogical the tragedy that the earth shuddered when he expired, causing the walls of the Vatican Palace to crack, contemporary accounts record. Interred in the Pantheon, an ancient temple to the gods transformed into a Christian church whose meaning and resonant architecture he, above all, in Rome most fully apprehended, Raphael was literally and symbolically enshrined in history. An apotheosis that seemed, with retrospective exegesis, foreshadowed in his late masterpiece, The Transfiguration. For the rest of the century, painters in Rome vied to be acclaimed his artistic heir and inherit the epithet Raphael Reborn, an honorific bestowed in succession on Parmigianino, Taddeo Zucchero, and Annibale Carracci. The latter two are buried, quite literally, in the shadow of Raphael, or more specifically of Raphael's tomb, and their epitaphs both, in fact, invoke the deceased deified painter. But it was not just posthumously as an ideal or artistic paradigm that Raphael's shadow loomed. In life, as a teacher, mentor, and head of a magnificently oiled and productive workshop, Raphael towered over, and yes, overshadowed, his devoted and talented pupils. His art and his persona, the consummate exemplar of a fairly new breed pioneered by Andrea Mantegna in Mantua and Leonardo da Vinci in Milan, the artist's courtier, a self-made man of intellect, wit, and extraordinarily wide-ranging talents and abilities, at home with, and invaluable to, the pontiff or prince who employed him. And this is Raphael's beautiful double portrait in the Louvre. He is the figure standing at the upper left looking out at us with his hand protectively and paternally on the shoulder of a second unidentified sitter. Lots of discussion and debate about who this is. I would love it to be Giulia Romano, which is an idea that's come up periodically in the literature, not widely accepted, but since nobody has come up with a completely compelling alternative today, we'll say that's Raphael and Giulia Romano. One of those garzoni, or boys, the young assistants of Raphael who trained and worked in his studio, was Perino del Vaga, who was born in 1501 and died in 1547. We're well informed about Perino's career and afforded occasional glimpses into his character and personality, thanks to the lengthy, detailed, and mostly laudatory account of his life written by his near contemporary, the painter, architect, and biographer Giorgio Vasari, who knew Perino personally and deeply admired his art, an admiration that, in fact, at times bordered on imitation. Vasari's art at certain moments really very closely emulates that of Perino. And I show you here the portrait of Perino, the woodcut portrait from Vasari's life of him, and that image is on view in the exhibition. And, of course, just to show you the beautiful newly acquired painting that is the focal point and centerpiece of that display. I just want to begin with a survey quickly of a few of Perino's early Roman works. And after he left Raphael's workshop, after Raphael's death, he did emerge as the preeminent fresco painter in Rome, both in terms of the quality and importance of the commissions he received, but really in terms of the sheer number of commissions for fresco painting. Sadly, many of those works survive in either damaged or severely compromised condition or don't survive at all. And this very short visual survey of a few of his early Roman works will show some of communicate to you the certain source of frustration attendant with studying this artist, which is namely the very poor state of preservation. Here I'm showing you two fragments from a very early work he did, one of his first independent works, an altarpiece representing the deposition of Christ that was destroyed, first beginning to be destroyed within 10 years of its creation by a flood of the Tiber, and then two successive floods completely ruined it, other than these fragments, which were probably salvaged by a later artist, Federico Zuccaro, the two crucified thieves who loomed over the body of the dead Christ, surrounded by mourners below, now preserved today in the Royal Collection at Hampton Court. Here, the ceiling of a painted chapel he did for a powerful patron, a close intimate of Pope Leo X, Cardinal Lorenzo Pucci, who was, like Perino, a Florentine, and probably commissioned him in part not only because he was a pupil of Raphael, but because he was a fellow Florentine. Here, Perino choosing the awkwardly shaped triangular compartments of this high Gothic vault for a series of narrative scenes illustrating the life of the Virgin. And I think you can see, looking at the compartment on the left, again, the condition problems that plague this work. This is beautiful, isn't it? A fresco from, I believe, around 1524-25, representing the Pietà, the Lamentation. It's in a church that has had an apartment building built over it, and I many years went with a friend to look at this, and we had some foreign matter streaming down the front, and our only explanation, we thought that the apartment that had been built over the chapel, that a pot of soup must have exploded on the stove and dripped down through the ceiling and down the front of this fresco. It's really tragic, the condition that these works survive in. But fortunately, we do have a big corpus of drawings by Perino, other later works that are better preserved, and what we know about his career from the very lengthy and detailed account of Vasari. This survives in pretty good condition. The last important fresco he executed before going to Genoa, following the sack of Rome in 1527, in the Church of San Marcello al Corso, a fresco of the Creation of Eve. Florentine by birth and early training, Perino was a pupil of Ridolfo Ghirlandaio, two of whose works I show you on the screen, the one on the right being a small triptych here at the Met. Ridolfo, the son of the 15th century painter Domenico Ghirlandaio, and a close friend of Raphael during the latter's years in Rome, in Florence, where he was from about 1504 to 1508. In fact, a seldom discussed bit of news reported by Vasari is that Raphael actually tried to persuade Ridolfo to join him in Rome after he himself went there, but being a dyed-in-the-wool Florentine and an unadventurous homebody, Ridolfo politely declined. But the bonds of amity between these two artists may, I think, have had some relevance to the later perambulations of the young Perino, as I'll explain a bit later. Ridolfo perpetuated Domenico Ghirlandaio's descriptive, accessible, devotional style into the early decades of the 16th century, overlaying it with echoes of Raphael's dignified grace. His art exemplifies the rather tradition-bound and somewhat insular current of Florentine High Renaissance painting, a conservative alternative to the expressive fusion of naturalism and artifice seen in the works of his contemporary Andrea del Sarto, the leading painter of the Florentine school in the teens and 20s, and the master of Perino's contemporaries, Pontormo and Rosso Fiorentino. So Ridolfo's unadorned, straightforward, and accessible idiom and the mechanical craft of painting behind it form the tradition in which the young Perino received his early training. But he was also trained, as were all Florentine painters of his generation, in the more modern Florentine manner represented by Michelangelo's Great Battle at Cascina cartoon, the school of the world, according to Vasari, a dramatically charged composition populated by straining, heroic male nudes deployed in a striking variety of complex and animated poses, which legions of young artists assiduously studied and copied. That cartoon, of course, is lost. It's known through various slightly later copies and iterations, the best of which is this one that you see on the screen, although this isn't the best image and the reproduction of it, and I'm sorry for that. Among these eager apprentices, Perino quickly distinguished himself as the best and most accomplished, this Vasari tells us, manifesting from the very outset the extraordinary talent and prodigious gifts as a draftsman for which he was acclaimed in his lifetime. The gifts that drawings collectors and connoisseurs have admired ever since, and which are abundantly on display in the current exhibition. And the drawing at the lower right, again, it's dark and hard to see. That's pretty much what it looks like, but it's a drawing probably from an early moment of Perino's career, a study, not for a picture, but an exercise showing these straining muscular nudes interacting with horses, clearly reflecting his study of both Michelangelo and Raphael here as models in Florence. Following the thread of Vasari's biographical narrative, we're led to the realization that was precisely this exceptional skill as a draftsman, a skill fueled by his study of Vasari's hero, Michelangelo, that accounted for Perino's lucky break. His entree into the hallowed circle of Raphael in Rome, a Parnassus for painters, and I'm showing you Raphael's Parnassus in the lower left, and on the upper right, a print by Bandinelli of his workshop, but just I think it's a great image of a Renaissance workshop and all the myriad activities that went on there. So Perino's great skill as a draftsman accounted for his lucky break, this entree into Raphael's workshop, or as the painter Sebastiano del Piombo, Raphael's churlish competitor and detractor, described his rival's entourage in a whining letter to his protector Michelangelo, the synagoga, the synagogue. That term was used, I think, to descriptively communicate the impenetrable, to Sebastiano anyway, nature of this privileged and closed operation, which to an outsider had the aura of being sanctified because of the favor shown by the Pope and the resulting monopoly over papal commissions. But Perino's lucky break didn't happen immediately. His early days in Rome, if not as trying as the trials of Job or the travails of David Copperfield, were nonetheless still quite an ordeal. Just when Perino arrived in Rome is unclear, but it was probably around the year 1516 that he was deposited there and promptly abandoned by a mysterious and now unknown artist who Vasari called Il Vaga, hence the name by which Perino was forever after known. And here are just some views of Rome, things that would have looked pretty much the way they did in his day. A neophyte newcomer to the Eternal City, the young artist was stupefied, that's Vasari's word, stupefied by the artistic marvels of ancient Rome. And I show you on the screen now a series of drawings by a northern artist who came to Rome and drew many, many of the antiquities, Martin von Heemskerk. Perino was stupefied by these artistic marvels of ancient Rome, the heroic sculptures, towering edifices, and evocative ruins that survived in such abundance, and that when seen for the first time had the capacity to literally induce a state of awe and wonder. Destitute, alone, and subject to every hardship imaginable, he resolved to overcome adversity and achieve success through sheer fortitude and diligent hard work. To that end, Perino devised a formula whereby he would divide his day, spending half the week working and the other half drawing, an exercise to which he would also devote all feast days and holidays, even at night. So I like to picture Perino drawing by night there somewhere, together with most nights, in order to become famous and leave behind his grim existence. So draw he did. He copied Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. Here again is that topos of Michelangelo pedagogy. He copied ancient sculptures. Sketchbook in hand, he crawled into the recently discovered murky subterranean chambers of the Golden House of Nero, where from the shadowy darkness dispelled by the light of a torch, extraordinary remains of ancient painting emerged. In the course of time, this diligence and hard work paid off. Perino was renowned as the best and most beautiful draftsman in Rome. And here are the potpourri of some of his drawings from different stages of his career to look at. Word of his remarkable gifts spread through the streets and reached the ears of Giulio Romano and Gianfrancesco Peni, Raphael's assistants, who, praising the young artist to their master, arranged a most fateful introduction. The door to the synagoga opened, and Perino entered. Several themes or tropes are woven into this account of Perino's early career. The first is the primacy of drawing. From the outset, even before coming to Rome, Perino showed extraordinary gifts as a draftsman, and his drawings served as a demonstration of his exceptional powers of disegno, of drawing, with a term that carried with it the attendant attribute of invenzione, the gifts of the imagination. And while that skill was innate, Perino's gifts as a draftsman, his powers of disegno were something he was born with, a sign of his ingenio, or an intelligence that was fueled by creativity, rather than mechanical or learned. It was a skill that was honed by studying Michelangelo, first in Florence and then in Rome. So here's the second theme. Michelangelo is the supreme model, which in the case of Perino actually also serves as a kind of literary device foreshadowing his own future heights, since some of the projects of Perino's late career brought him physically in proximity to works by Michelangelo. He designed tapestries and paintings in stucco that literally surrounded things already done by Michelangelo, which in that later part of his biography is a sure token of the sign that he had arrived. The formative influence of Michelangelo was augmented by that of classical antiquity, an influence for which drawing, again, served as a conduit. So these themes, drawing, Michelangelo, antiquity, are all interrelated. For artists in Rome at this time, and those in Raphael's circle in particular, this immersion went far deeper than just copying motifs and fastly incorporating an acanthus scroll or a paraphrase of the Apollo Belvedere into their art. It meant apprehending the ethos that animated and gave meaning to these forms, understanding the culture they came from, and invoking it in their artistic recreations, the spirit of antiquarianism. And wrapped up with the themes of the primacy of drawing, Michelangelo, and antiquity is a fourth thread that's woven through Perino's early biography, and that's the importance of diligence and hard work, often coupled with adversity in his case, as a foundation for success. The greater the adversity, the more stunning the ultimate success becomes. Perino is orphaned at a young age. He's suckled by a goat. He's poor. He's taken under the wing of a dubious master who turns out to be a ne'er-do-well and is left alone to his own devices in Rome, barely a boy. But buoyed by a fierce determination to become famous, he resolves to draw, to study the works of Michelangelo, and to explore the ruins and remains of ancient Rome. He at last achieves the highest success. He survives his trials and becomes a pupil of Raphael. After Raphael's death, he emerges as the preeminent mural painter in Rome, as I've said. After that, he becomes court artist to a powerful and storied ruler and naval hero, Andrea Doria, in Genoa. And ultimately, ascending to the highest pinnacle, he returns to Rome and reprises Raphael's role at the papal court of Paul III in his final years. And these drawings do represent all these stages of his career. Herein is a model and a lesson plan for all aspiring artists wishing to achieve similar enviable heights. And indeed, considered from a certain critical vantage point, Vasari's Life of Perino does read like a formula or prescription, which is why we encounter elements of the narrative reenacted in the biography of other artists. Among those are Vasari himself, who, as I've already said, was a great admirer and emulator of Perino. We hear that he endured domestic unpleasantness while an apprentice, in his case to Andrea del Sarto, and this was at the hands of the artist's shrewish wife, who he described unflatteringly as faithless, jealous, and flirtatious with his assistants, and who, Vasari again relocating to Rome with his compagno Francesco Salviati, resolved to draw day and night. Sound familiar? Another instance of this recurring pattern is the biography of Taddeo Zucchero, an artistic, if not literal, disciple of Perino, whose style deeply influenced his, and who was a leading mid-century claimant to the title Raphael Reborn, inherited from the recently deceased Perino. Taddeo died too late to be included in Vasari's vitae, but his brother Federico compiled a narrative and pictorial biography which recounts how the young artist dutifully spent his time drawing, copying the works of Michelangelo and Raphael, working by moonlight, and there is a little moon. Oops. Well, I don't know how to use the pointer, but look to the left and you'll see the moon, and studying the antique. Here's Taddeo dutifully reenacting the biography of Perino. And just as Perino's diligence, skill, and hard work commended him to Raphael, so did Taddeo's youthful efforts command the attention of Michelangelo, a sure augury of his impending fame. Now, I don't mean to suggest that Vasari's biography of Perino is pure invention. His account, in its essentials, is, I believe, accurate. There'd be no reason, literary, rhetorical, or didactic, to make up stories about inconsequential personalities like Perino's first master, Andrea de Chieri, a candle painter and foster parent of sorts to the orphan boy, who Vasari talks about with specificity. Or to make up a story about Perino having broken his arm when back in Rome around 1540, an injury which made it difficult for him to work for a time, another nugget of biographical minutia that we can accept as fact. When we as readers encounter these kinds of specific and precise pieces of information, devoid of vagaries or hyperbole or suspicious symbolic resonance, we're obliged to consider them truthful, unless we have compelling reasons for discounting such testimony. At the same time, though, the life of Perino was probably embellished with some literary flourishes or biographical license, undertaken in the service of the author's pedagogical purpose of having the lives function on one level as an instruction manual. With this in mind, before turning to the Raphael shadow part of my lecture, I just wanted to float a possible more mundane alternative to the brilliant young artist's discovery by more established master Topos, encountered in Perino's biography as a vehicle for explaining the circumstances behind his fateful introduction to Raphael. And in his case, that more established master discoverer was Giulio Romano, who was really an established assistant, but nonetheless older and already successful, and therefore suitable for being cast in this part in the Perino narrative. I wonder if Perino's introduction to Raphael was instead provided by his teacher in Florence, Ridolfo Ghirlandaio, who, having turned down his old friend Raphael's request to join him in Rome when his workload started picking up, recommended to him his talented young protege. And here it's interesting to note that Raphael may actually have been briefly in Florence in 1515, right at the moment when Ridolfo is Perino's teacher, and shortly before the presumed time of Perino's departure from Florence to Rome. If that conjecture were to turn out to be true, and in the absence of some letter of introduction or some other historical document that will surely never materialize coming forward, this must remain conjecture, but if it turns out to be true, Giulio Romano's role in Perino's success trajectory is obviated, requiring that we ask, how did Giulio get into Perino's biography in this way? And here is Giulio looking a little weary at the end of his life. But doesn't he look like that other guy in the Louvre double self-portrait? Here, a possibility to consider is that this detail is an interpolation furnished by Giulio Romano himself. As he did Perino, Vasari knew Giulio personally. He visited him in Mantua, where Giulio spent the last decades of his life as court artist to the Gonzaga, reprising the role of his predecessor Mantegna. And while there, Vasari was gathering details for that biography. And there are reasons why Giulio absolutely would have liked this version of events, the version that has him discovering Perino. A number of contemporaneous sources record the fact that there was a certain division and rivalry and discord among Raphael's pupils in the years following his unexpected death in 1520. We learn that Giulio and his fellow pupil and partner Pani, the co-discoverer of Perino and co-heir with Giulio of Raphael's workshop, we learn that Giulio and Pani felt threatened by Perino's tremendous success in Rome in the years following Raphael's death, a threat that they sought to neutralize by marrying Perino off to Pani's sister, Caterina, thereby aligning him more closely to their own camp. By taking credit for discovering Perino, Giulio's upstart rival becomes, in the Vasarian narrative, his creato. Or maybe it did all happen exactly as Vasari narrated. Whatever the case, Perino was ushered into Raphael's Sanctum Sanctorum, to continue the synagogue metaphor, probably in 1516. His hand has been discerned correctly, I am convinced, in the decorations of the jewel box-like chamber known as the Loggia of Cardinal Bibbiena in the Vatican Palace. You see it on the left, and this detail on the right, a really old, bad image, I'm sorry, but has often been pointed to in the literature as the evidence of Perino's intervention here, and I think that's absolutely right. Together with the stufetta or bathroom painted by Raphael's workshop for the same patron, these classicizing decorations constitute the most sophisticated and thoroughgoing all'antica revival yet attempted in Renaissance Rome. On the left, details of the Loggia, and on the right, one of the ancient models that obviously provided the source material. And Perino's time here also served as a trial run for the far more expansive and ambitious decorations of the Vatican Loggia, both for himself and for the workshop. Successfully demonstrating his competence as a painter in this small private space, Perino graduated to the far grander, far more ambitious, and far more public, within the semi-private nature of the Vatican Palace, commission that Raphael and his shop were about to embark on. The Loggia that you see here on the screen now, a long corridor of 13 tall bays running along the flank of the Vatican stanze, the Pope's private apartments, and originally open on the side where the windows are to the out of doors, were richly embellished with a series of biblical scenes in the vaults and basamenti, the basamenti being the lower panels under the windows along the right. 5 in each bay, 5 narratives in each bay, 4 in each vault, and 1, as I said, along the lower level, for a total of 65 narratives. Here are 2 of the biblical scenes in the vaults. And embellished too with an abundant and endlessly inventive array of classicizing and naturalistic decorative details and still life motifs on the walls and pilasters. Sadly, just to point out the obvious, the fresco decoration of the pilasters and walls in particular is very damaged and in perilous condition, unfortunately, but even in its state today, I think you still get an idea of the extraordinary wealth of detail and inventiveness that went into this decoration. And all was framed by richly embellished stucco surrounds, brimming with tiny figures, all'antica vignettes, and rigorously ordered decorative details. The parentage of this ensemble and the ancient models that Raphael and his humanist friends and his learned patrons and his eager pupils immersed themselves in. They went to look at things like the Colosseum, where evocative remains of ancient stucco were still to be found. They went to the Golden House of Nero. They went to Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli. The excitement that attended their discovery, their first viewing of these things is unmistakable and immaculate, and the loggia stand is the purest evocation of the ancient world, yet conjured in Renaissance Rome. A lengthy look at the Vatican loggia would have us stray too far from the subject at hand today, so I just wanted to mention here 3 points that are relevant to Perino and his career. In this campaign, in the loggia, Perino worked closely with Raphael's collaborator, Giovanni da Udine, a brilliant specialist in highly naturalistic still life details and archaeological sophisticated classicizing decorative schemes, and master stuccatori. All of these stucco details that we've been looking at were certainly designed by him and in large part executed by him, who after much experimentation, Vasari tells us, succeeded in mastering the ancient technique for creating glistening white stucco, using what had already been recovered before him by earlier artists working in the Renaissance, but somehow discovering what had been missing to recreate in its purest form this beautiful, white, limpid kind of stucco. As a result of this collaboration, Giovanni da Udine and Perino became a second team in the Raphael workshop and were assigned to carry out the last major unfinished room in the suite of semi-public ceremonial spaces in the Vatican, the Sala dei Pontefici. I show you here the decorative vault of that large chamber, which is exactly 1 floor below the Sala di Costantino, the last room in the suite of stanze upstairs, where Giulio Romano, Paini, and Raphael himself started working in 1519, immediately after the completion of the loggia. And there's the famous scene of the Battle of Constantine from the Sala di Costantino. These 2 rooms of exactly the same size, and the subject matter of both rooms is actually continuous. Very different kinds of imagery, but it seems to me unquestionable that these were formulated and conceived at the same time, and I believe that this 2-tiered decoration was undertaken at the same time, which would mean that the ceiling on the right was begun during Raphael's lifetime and during the pontificate of Leo X. And I'm sure looking at it, you immediately see how now blown up to a monumental proportion, these artists are plumbing what they've been looking at and studying in the remains of antiquity, and here recasting that into a ceiling for a sacred space or Christian space within the Vatican. From Giovanni da Udine, Perino learned the highly specialized art and craft of stucco work, becoming in his own right a master stuccatore. He put this expertise to work in the great artistic campaigns of his mature career. The artistic interiors, the interiors of the Palazzo Doria in Genoa, I'm sorry I don't have a slide of that, carried out for a period of time from 1528 through about 1534, and later back in Rome, the splendid stucco work in the ceilings of the Sala Regia on the left in the Vatican, a room that's virtually impossible to get into, but arguably this is the greatest surviving stucco work of the 16th century in Rome, and on the right, the Sala Paolina and Castel St. Angelo, both major commissions carried out for Pope Paul III. Not only did Perino acquire a technical and artistic mastery as a result of his work in the loggia, he was also initiated into a highly refined, ambitious, and sophisticated kind of imagery and iconography then being formulated by Raphael in response to his archaeological investigations. The pictorial narrative of the loggia is an encyclopedic history of the creation of the universe, one that synthesizes in a grand syncretic unity, pagan and Christian, Old Testament and New Testament, the world of art and the world of nature, the personal history of Pope Clement, Pope Leo X, Vicar of Christ on earth, whose personal emblems, lions, rings, Medici, feathers, a yoke, punctuate and personalize the decorative imagery, synthesizing this with Christological history and the cosmology of God's divine scheme. So having emerged from the shadows of obscurity and destitution and into the light radiating from the star that was Raphael, and I do think this image of a sun with planets revolving around it, planets of different sizes, is a really apt metaphor for thinking about Raphael and his pupils. Having emerged into the light, Perino found himself in the later teens in the extraordinarily busy, productive, and energized place that was Raphael's workshop. And I show you on the screen Marcantonio's wonderful engraved portrait of Raphael at rest in his studio, surrounded by some of the details of the stucco release from the Vatican that actually show the workshop at work. Members of the workshop working in the loggia, carving the stucco, making stucco, drawing, mixing pigments. This is Raphael's workshop at work, working on what we see here. It's really an extraordinary conceit. This workshop was a lively place, sizzling with creativity and intensive labor, where the master taught his pupils to draw, where the pupils were enlisted as studio models to pose for the drawings, where pigments were ground, where experimentation with oil paint and with stucco occurred, where prints that would disseminate Raphael's ideas and inventions and fame far and wide were orchestrated, where complex compositions of operatic grandeur and drama and monumental scale were conceived and tested and revised and finally codified, where poetic beauty and sacred meaning were given form, where bawdy jokes were told, where ancient Rome was reawakened and reassembled, where the writings of the ancients, of Vitruvius and Pliny and Valerius Maximus, were consulted, and where pranks were played. Anytime you get a bunch of boys together, they're going to fool around. And evidence of this emerged when one of the stanze dell'incendio, was restored some years ago, and stuck into the surface of the fire in the Borgo, the conservators found a bean. And they decided that what had happened was when the Garzoni were up there working one day and eating lunch, one of them said to the other one, let's stick a bean into the surface of the fresco and see what happens. And that bean stayed there for 500 years until it was found a couple decades ago. So I think it was a fun place to work. And there's the fresco, by the way, where the bean was found on the left. In these years, in addition to the Vatican loggia, Raphael and his workshop were engaged in the last stages of the stanza dell'incendio on the left, and the initial stages of the Sala di Costantino decorations. We saw the Battle of Constantine already. They were undertaking the frescoes of the Villa Farnesina. Here you see the famous Loggia of Psyche, painted for the wealthiest banker in Christendom. More details of that and the kinds of drawings that Raphael made for his pupils to follow, that his pupils made in close emulation of their master. The workshop was receiving commissions for altarpieces and private devotional images. Raphael was involved in the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica and the designing of the Villa Madama, one of the most, really the most ambitious recreation of an ancient Roman villa yet undertaken. And perhaps most ambitiously, a project to create a plan and thus symbolically recover all of ancient Rome. This was a disciplined, methodical, and painstaking undertaking to which Raphael, probably assisted by Giovanni da Udine, his companion in some of his field trips to investigate ruins inside and outside of Rome, a project to which Raphael applied his sophisticated, archaeologically grounded understanding of antiquity, and one that learned humanists and intellectuals and antiquarians of Renaissance Rome followed quite literally with bated breath, eagerly awaiting word of each new discovery and installment. And this incredible drawing on the left of one of the horses of the Quirinal, shown also in a drawing by another artist at the lower right, probably by Raphael. Notice how everything is all measured in a very detailed way. This results, the documentation really of his trying to not only capture the forms, but really understand how each of these things were constructed and fully grasp each. It's been suggested that this drawing may also be the work of Giovanni da Udine. It's probably by Raphael, but this idea that he had the help of some of his very well-trained assistants in his shop in this incredibly ambitious and time-consuming undertaking, I think is absolutely right. Raphael was able to do so much at once because of his own prodigious energy, of course, too much of which, according to the disapproving Vasari, was spent womanizing, but that happened mostly at night. But also because his assistants were talented, numerous, and well organized. In some projects, like the Loggia, they all worked together. For others, they formed teams, with some of them designated his deputies. For frescoes, altarpieces, and devotional images, the primary executants were Giulio and Pani, his disciples of long standing. For stucco and the most all'antica decorations, which included elements of fresco painting, the lead team was Giovanni da Udine and Perino. For his architectural and engineering projects, Raphael relied on Antonio da Sangallo, the younger, as a deputy. The head of his printmaking operation was the brilliant engraver Marcantonio Raimondi, himself the head of a group of printmaking assistants. And over this fattoria, this factory where art was made, and whose manager, the modestly talented Pani, was accordingly known as Il Fattore, over this fattoria, Raphael presided, his loud voice resounding in the cacophonous studio, his generous spirit inspiring filial love and devotion on the part of his loyal disciples. Now, these last remarks might strike you as frivolous, romantic imaginings about Raphael, but in fact, these are aspects of his person and his character that are corroborated by historical evidence. When Raphael's remains were exhumed in the Pantheon on September 14, 1833, here you see his bones, 3 distinctive physical characteristics were observed of his intact skeleton. The bones of his right hand had a spur, which was caused by holding brushes and chalk. He had a small skull, and he had an unusually large larynx, which meant that he had an exceptionally loud voice. So I think he really did use it in his workshop. And how do we know that this clarion-voiced master was loved by his pupils? Again, the historical record speaks. 2 of them, Giulio Romano and Giovanni da Udine, named their sons Raffaello, a familial honorific and act of reverence that undoubtedly signaled this attachment on both their parts. Perino didn't have a son, only a daughter, and some of us think she was the model for the baby in the Holy Family, Lavinia. So no similar act of devotion is recorded on his part. But Vasari does expressly say of the relationship between Perino and Raphael, quote, Perino always showed submission and great obedience toward Raphael, and that he was loved by Raphael himself as if he were his own son. I've tried to describe not only the organizational structure of Raphael's workshop and to give some idea of Perino's role in it, but also to invoke something of its animating spirit. Truly, this was an extraordinary, exhilarating place. So other than perfecting his skills as a painter and a draftsman and mastering the art of stucco, what did Perino reap from his time as Raphael's pupil and apprentice, from his years in the shadow of Raphael? Well, one thing he learned was how to organize his own workshop, or fattoria. In Genoa in the late 1520s and early 1530s, and again in Rome in the 1540s until his death, he gathered around him his own cadre of talented assistants and executants, the teams that allowed him to carry out his own numerous commissions for Andrea Doria and later for the Pope. The latter company included the likes of Daniele da Volterra, Girolamo Cicciolante da Sermonetta, Marco Pino, Guglielmo della Porta, and probably Pellegrino Tebaldi. Unfamiliar names all except to specialists, but all important artists with successful independent careers in the 16th century after their time in Perino's workshop. This was a practice that another Raphael Garzone, Giulio Romano, was also steeped in and also tried to replicate during his years in Mantua, though far less successfully, owing to a much smaller and lamentably untalented local talent pool. Giulio actually complained about the dearth of capable assistants there, so his experience as a court artist trying to replicate the model of Raphael was much less successful. And obviously tied up with this idea of a workshop is the spirit of collaboration among artists, which was clearly a central lesson of the Raphael workshop. And perhaps most important, this is jumping ahead, but we'll leave this on the screen, what Perino learned, and learned well at Raphael's knee, as it were, was a code of behavior, the importance of grace, refinement, and good manners. These were the qualities and attributes that contemporaries extolled in Raphael, and that, coupled with his extraordinary talent, helped catapult him to the very pinnacle of the Roman art world as the favorite of the most powerful bankers, the most influential prelates, the most learned humanists, and of course, two discriminating and demanding popes. Raphael, in his demeanor and comportment, in fact, defined the archetype of the artist courtier, a persona crafted, no doubt, with the instruction of his friend, the humanist and diplomat Baldassare Castiglione, author of the celebrated book of The Courtier. Raphael portrayed Castiglione here in all his refined, elegant, and understated aspect, employing a subtly limited palette as a means of underscoring the exquisite subtlety of the sitter's manner, demeanor, and mind in this extraordinarily acute portrait. And he portrayed himself endowed with the same keen and subtle intellect, announcing thereby his social parity. No brushes or palette or other tools of the trade, just his intellect. Talent plus manners did not always equal a successful tenure as court artist. Parmigianino, Perino's exact contemporary and a pretender to the title Raphael Reborn, who, Vasari tells us, quote, imitated Raphael in everything, but especially painting, unquote, possessed both talent and good manners in abundance, at least until his increasingly odd behavior and consuming interest in alchemy perverted his elegant demeanor. But he never achieved that ultimate status of court artist. In the case of Perino, however, a legitimate heir of Raphael, the formula worked. One last topic to cover in assessing Perino's life in the shadow of Raphael is that of shadow itself, of the darkness of Raphael's late style. The origins of this dark manner, or maniera oscura, lie in Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was present in Rome in the years between 1513 and 1516, ensconced in rooms in the Belvedere in the Vatican Palace. Mysterious and magus-like, he spent his unproductive days experimenting with oils and varnishes, providing the impetus perhaps for Raphael's experimentation with the Leonardesque smoky darkness in his later works. The fact that an element of shadow, when introduced, allowed painters to achieve relievo, relief, a quality that is an attribute of sculpture, as writers like Castiglione observed, thereby anticipating a thread of the Paragone debate over the relative merits of painting versus sculpture that would come to the fore of artistic discourse later in the century, made a dark style praiseworthy to the proponents of painting's superior virtues. Painting could approximate the effects of sculpture by being able to describe relief through the use of a dark style. Fueled perhaps by his activities as keeper or superintendent of antiquities, for Raphael, the issue appears to have been, in his mind, in these years, evidenced in the increasing plasticity and sculptural quality of his figures, both in his paintings and his drawings, and the quotations of sculptural models that pepper his later works. To his ever-critical rival, Sebastiano del Piombo, Raphael's late dark style made his paintings look like they were, quote, darkened by smoke, or rather like figures of iron which shine all light and dark, unquote. To Raphael, however, the dark style must have been yet another means of reviving antiquity. The shadowy realm of the subterranean chambers of the Domus Aurea and the arched passageways of the Colosseum is the shadowy, mysterious realm of the Transfiguration and of the Holy Family known as La Perla. And the shadowy realm of Giulio Romano's altarpiece in Santa Maria dell'Anima, where we seem to literally glimpse the shadowy arcades of the Colosseum. And the dark style itself was an invocation of a manner of painting used by the ancients and described by Pliny, particularly the use of a layer of dark varnish known as atramentum, applied to a painting in order to soften the tonality of the colors and impart a unifying smoky veil. What to Sebastiano looked darkened by smoke, to Raphael and his followers looked like a revival of an ancient manner of painting. This brings us finally to Perino del Vaga's Holy Family with St. John the Baptist in the center. What strikes me about this work is its duality. Its homage to Florentine sources on the one hand, to Raphael's Florentine Madonnas, an example of which is on the left, to Fra Bartolomeo, and especially to Ridolfo, his teacher, a Holy Family in the upper right, but also to Raphael's late style, represented by the work at the lower right. That late style of Raphael with its certa oscurità, its certain obscurity. On the other, a unique work of his early Roman period, and we just can't emphasize again how rare this is. There are no other private devotional images of this kind from his years in Rome. The painting is Perino's iteration of a Raphaelesque dark manner, and the work that above any other shows him in a most thoughtful and calculating way in the shadow of Raphael. Thank you.
I'm delighted to welcome Professor Sheryl Reiss, our second speaker. Professor Reiss studied at Princeton University under the great Raphael specialist John Sherman. She's currently on the faculty of the University of Southern California, having previously taught at other major institutions, including Smith College and Cornell University. Although her interests are wide-ranging, encompassing such subjects as secular women patrons of Renaissance Italy, about which she has published extensively, and the artistic exchange between Italy and Northern Europe, she has returned repeatedly to the engrossing issues relating to artistic culture in Rome during the reign of Pope Clement VII. Born Giulio de' Medici in Florence in 1478, nephew of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and Pope from 1523 to 34. As I mentioned in my general introduction, and as Linda has now discussed, this decade, the 1520s, with its striking highs and lows, is that during which our Perino Holy Family was painted. No other speaker would be better able to introduce us to this moment of artistic, political, and religious ferment. Sheryl is currently preparing a book-length study on Giulio de' Medici as a patron of the arts, and today she will speak on Great Expectations, Shattered Dreams, Pope Clement VII and Art in Rome in the 1520s. Please welcome Professor Reiss.
Thank you very much. I need quickly to change my glasses to do this. I'm very grateful to the Metropolitan Museum of Art for inviting me to speak in today's Sunday at the Met program in association with the really beautiful Perino del Vaga show in New York exhibition, which I encourage you all to see if you've not yet done so. Special thanks are due to Linda Wolk-Simon, who curated the show, Andrea Baer, Julia Valiella, who is a former student of mine, Jennifer Mock, Nicole Leist, and Joseph Lowe. Before I begin, I should say that as my title suggests, I will not be speaking about Perino specifically. Instead, I will be discussing the milieu around him in Rome of the 1520s. And here are the two extraordinary works purchased by the Met. On November 25th, 1523, Michelangelo in Florence wrote to his stonecutter Topolino in Carrara with important news, and I quote, "You will have heard that Medici has been made pope, because of which it seems to me everyone is rejoicing, and I think that here, as for art, there would be much to be done." Michelangelo spoke of Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, it's right over here, seen here at the left of Raphael's famed portrait of Pope Leo X and two cardinals of 1518. As Andrea mentioned, Giulio was the posthumous and illegitimate son of Giuliano de' Medici, the younger brother of the famed Lorenzo the Magnificent de' Medici, and Cardinal Giulio was first cousin to Leo X, who had died in December 1521. And I should say that the beautiful portrait of Clement's father, Giuliano de' Medici, at the left of the screen is currently here in New York and will be seen in the wonderful portraiture exhibition that will open on the 19th. And here is another Medici family tree to show you here, over here, where he fits in. Cardinal Giulio would be the second Medici to ascend the papal throne, taking as his papal name Clement VII. As early as 1515, it had been predicted that he would become Pope himself. In the illuminated frontispiece to a poem written that year, seen at the left of the screen, the kneeling author, Ottavio Rossi, presents his work to the cardinal. In the manuscript that you see at the left, which is in the Vatican, we read, and I quote, "And with time you will be pastor of the Apostolic See." In Rossi's opinion, not only was Giulio de' Medici destined for the papal throne, he would also be a great patron. We read again, under Giulio, virtue, under Giulio, the glory of the muses. Giulio will be the Maecenas of our time, end quote. In a similar vein, in a later book illustration at your right by an associate of Perino del Vaga's, this illustration shows the goddess Minerva commanding Fortune to present the cardinal with the papal tiara, and that's over here. According to Clement's contemporary Francesco Vittori, however, Giulio de' Medici was the victim of Fortune's antipathy, and during his disastrous pontificate, the Reformation gathered its forces, gravely weakening the church. Imperial troops sacked the city of Rome in May of 1527, and Henry VIII removed England from the papal flock. Vittori wrote that Giulio de' Medici, and I quote, endured tremendous disappointment to go from being a great and highly regarded cardinal to a small and little esteemed pope. In the 19th century, Leopold von Ranke described Clement as probably the most disastrous pontiff to sit on St. Peter's throne. And in 1908, an English scholar, Herbert Vaughan, said, "Few persons have perhaps been detested or reviled by mankind with better reason than this papal bastard of the house of Medici," end quote. It's a sad one. Clement VII also has the dubious honor of being included in a book entitled The Bad Popes. At his elevation to the papal throne, however, no one foresaw the calamities ahead. My talk this afternoon will examine aspects of Clement's art patronage in the first few years of his ill-fated pontificate. Excuse me. In what follows, I will juxtapose the great expectations of artists in 1523 with the bitter disappointments they soon endured, culminating in the ruinous impact of the sack of Rome, which shattered their dreams of a new Medician golden age. And just to show you, this is a detail of a hand-colored print showing the sack of Rome. Here is Pope Clement on top of the Castel Sant'Angelo praying for deliverance. Clement VII's coronation took place on November 26, 1523, the day after Michelangelo wrote the letter with which I began. One contemporary observer described a triumphal arch on which the new pontiff was described as the bringer of peace to the world. With Clement's election, there were widespread predictions of great things to come, as in the pamphlets here that you see on the screen, the one at the right describing the joy of Rome at the election of Clement VII. Literati were overjoyed. One Roman humanist wrote, and I quote, "I can't begin to tell you how much change there is in everyone's spirits because of the new pontiff." And the Venetian author, Pietro Bembo, wrote, "Clement will be the greatest and the wisest pope whom the church has seen for centuries." Poets hailed the arrival of the new Medician golden age in which the arts and letters would flourish in Rome after the perceived neglect of his despised predecessor, the Dutch-born reform-minded Pope Adrian VI, whom you see at the right. Saturn's reign has come back, they said, or I think the golden age has returned. Many poems glorified Clement as a friend of the arts, and a Roman humanist wrote to a friend in Venice, the literary arts, already almost put to flight by barbarian neglect, hope to be restored. For he, that is Clement, is a genuine Medici who cherishes beauty and poetic genius. It was expected that papal Rome would once again be a powerful magnet that would draw talented individuals from throughout Italy and indeed the Christian world. As Michelangelo's letter cited above demonstrates, artists as well as literati took part in the general delight at Giulio de' Medici's ascent to the papal throne. Clement VII was a true Medici, the last male descendant of a family revered for its patronage of art, and a patron with a proven track record, if you will, during his cardinalate. As cardinal, Giulio de' Medici initiated or acting on behalf of his cousin Leo X supervised several of the best-known Roman and Florentine artistic undertakings of the 16th century. I'll just run through these very quickly. These include the Villa Madama designed by Raphael, which we heard about briefly on Monte Mario, the great dual commission for Sebastiano del Piombo's Raising of Lazarus at your left, and Raphael's Artistic Testament, the Transfiguration, at your right, intended for a cathedral in southern France. The never-realized facade of the Medici Parish Church, San Lorenzo in Florence, designed by Michelangelo. And the new sacristy, also begun there by Michelangelo, but never completed. Giulio de' Medici was also an important patron of the so-called minor arts, and examples of metalwork, glass, and maiolica, as well as many precious tapestries and embroideries were created for him or presented to him as gifts during his cardinalate and his ill-fated pontificate. And I show at the left a gilt bronze presentation medal for his cardinal seal, and at the right a maiolica plate that was probably presented to him as a gift early in his pontificate with arms of two prominent Florentine families. Throughout his ecclesiastic career, moreover, Giulio de' Medici commissioned many illuminated manuscripts, and others were given to him. And I show you two that were done for him during his cardinalate by an extraordinary illuminator named Matteo da Milano. As cardinal and as pope, Giulio de' Medici was what I have called elsewhere a hands-on patron. He visited artist studios and building sites, and he expressed opinions on artistic issues, including color, style, iconography, and the durability of materials. On one occasion, Clement stated explicitly that he wanted his tomb and that of Leo, then being planned for San Lorenzo in Florence, done, and I love this, a mio modo, that is to say, my way. Perhaps the most striking facet of his personality as a patron is his concern with practical details. All indications are that he considered himself knowledgeable about such matters and that he enjoyed giving advice to artists. For example, in June 1520, Cardinal Giulio instructed his overseer at the Villa Madama about a specific tool to be used for preparing stucco. In February of 1524, when he was pope, Clement sent Michelangelo a recipe for making stucchi, the plural of stucco, with instructions for the artist to read Vitruvius. Michelangelo may not have been so pleased about that advice. In 1526, the Pope sent very specific instructions on the slaking of lime, and in July of 1533, Sebastiano del Piombo reported to Michelangelo that the Pope wished Giovanni da Udine to use the most durable possible colors for the vault of the new sacristy, specifying that fugitive colors, what specific fugitive colors the artist was to avoid. So he really liked being involved. And on more than one occasion, Clement corrected architectural drawings that had been sent to him by Michelangelo, and there was this extraordinary back and forth of drawings between artist and patron and back again. In Vasari's life, Clement, the new pontiff, is presented as a model as a model patron who single-handedly revived the visual arts nearly extinguished under Adrian, whom you see there at the right. In his Life of Giulio Romano, for example, Vasari narrates the anguished state of the arts under the barbarian Dutchman, as he calls him, during whose reign artists like Perino del Vaga, Sebastiano del Piombo, and Giovanni da Udine nearly died from hunger, in Vasari's words. Vasari then describes the God-willed election of the second Medici Pope, and I quote now, with which in a single day all the arts of design, along with the other virtuous skills, came back to life, end quote. Thus revived in a single day, the arts seemed indeed to have found a friend of artistic virtuosity. Let's see. At the outset of his pontificate, Clement clearly intended to live up to the precedents established by his celebrated family and by his papal predecessors, Julius II at your upper right, and his cousin Leo X. Vasari recognized Giulio de' Medici's self-consciousness as a patron in a passage in his life of the architect Antonio da San Gallo the Younger, and I quote, "Thus the new Pope Clement VII was created by heaven, full of generosity and following in the footsteps of Leo and of other ancestors from his most illustrious family, he thought to himself that having already made beautiful things to remember during his cardinalate, he should during his pontificate go beyond all the others in the restoring and the adorning of buildings." That Clement himself wished to be seen as responsible for a revival of the visual arts is attested to most eloquently by the decoration of one of the window frames in the Sala di Costantino in the Vatican Palace. And here you see two views of the room, which Linda Wolk-Simon told us about a little bit. Work on the Great Papal Reception Room, with frescoes devoted to the Emperor Constantine, begun by Raphael under Leo X, had ceased with that pope's death in December 1521, but began again soon after Clement's election. In this fresco, and we see this up here at the top, in this fresco, we see female personifications of the arts glorifying Clement's personal device or impresa, which shows the rays of the sun setting a tree ablaze after having passed harmlessly through a crystal globe. The impresa features the motto Candor Illesos, or whiteness unharmed, an allusion to Giulio de' Medici's unassailable virtue. According to the author Paolo Giovio, this ingenious device was devised for Cardinal Giulio in the summer of 1522 following a conspiracy against his life. In the Sala di Costantino allegory, three winged figures write, carve, and paint the motto, while a fourth, seen here, seated on a rocky form, demonstrates the conceit, with an armillary sphere at her feet. This fresco, completed by 1524, reminded viewers who attended events in the Sala di Costantino of Clement's love for the arts and promised a new golden age of papal patronage. There we go. In the baptism of Constantine, one of the frescoes painted during Clement's pontificate, the pontiff appears in the guise of Pope Sylvester I, baptizing Constantine. The prominent inscription, that's here at your lower right, reads, "Clement VII, Pontifex Maximus, completed what Leo X began, 1524. At this point, I would like to summarize some of the artistic and architectural undertakings in the first years of Clement's reign. Financial records and inventories bear witness to the many splendid works of metalwork, embroidery, woodwork, and tapestry, not to mention illuminated manuscripts in crystal that were produced in the first year of Clement's reign. To give you an idea of the splendor of these precious works, I show here a beautiful surviving Clementine object from the years before the sack. At your left, Valerio Belli's crystal crucifix with the four evangelists, which was described by Vasari as divine, and at the right, a tapestry hanging for use behind the papal throne. And I apologize that I was not able to get a color slide of this very beautiful tapestry, which the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Thomas Campbell, in fact, has worked on. And here are examples from two Clementine illuminated manuscripts. From the first at your left, a composite page in Harvard from about 1523 to 24. The second at your right, a truly splendid manuscript from the early 1530s. The enrichment of the treasury and the altars and floors of the Vatican, as well as the outfitting of its inhabitants in costly liturgical vestments, contributed to the new pontiff's visual proclamation of papal majesty, in Latin, Majestas Papalis. Clement's promises to the Sacred College of Cardinal at his election included as the third item the continuation of the building of New St. Peter's begun by Bramante in 1506 under Pope Julius II and supervised by Raphael during the pontificate of Leo X. The drawing I show you here now, attributed to a northern artist who visited Rome in the 1520s, records the basilica's appearance at the outset of Clement's reign. But during the first years of Clement's pontificate, progress was slow, and after the sack of Rome in 1527, the pontiff reduced the scope of the project considerably. Urbanism in Clementine Rome is a topic of considerable interest. His urban interventions include the completion of Leo X's plans for roads extending from the Piazza del Popolo, and that's up in this area. And during his pontificate, there were plans for extensive urban development in the area around the Ponte Sant'Angelo, which is over this area of town, also called the Quartiere dei Banchi. This area of the city, the gateway to the Vatican and the surrounding neighborhood of the Borgo, was inhabited predominantly by Tuscans, and in 1519, Giulio de' Medici himself had placed the foundation stone for the Church of the Florentine community in Rome, San Giovanni dei Fiorentini. Antonio da San Gallo the Younger's innovative concave facade of the papal mint, or zecca, was nearby, seen here at your left in a drawing, a detail of a drawing by Martin van Heemskerk, the Netherlandish artist who was in Rome in the 1530s, and as it looks today, the zecca dates to Clement's pontificate before the sack. A late 16th century description of it records a now lost inscription on the facade that alluded to the return of the Golden Age and to universal peace, prominent Clementine themes as we have seen prior to the sack of Rome. As Cardinal and Pope, Giulio de' Medici was deeply interested in antiquity, and in April 1527, shortly before the sack, Marco Fabio Calvo dedicated his study of the ancient regions of Rome to Clement, and you see the frontispiece and an illustration. At the Vatican, the Pope was concerned with the Belvedere Sculpture Court, where the famed papal collections of antiquities was displayed. Between July 1524 and June 1525, repairs were made to two ancient statues of river gods there, and I show you one of them at the left. And in January of 1525, a colossal statue of Jupiter was discovered on the property of a cardinal who presented it as a present to Clement for his villa, the Villa Madama on Monte Mario. This torso at your right, installed in a later base, is now in the Louvre and is called the Jupiter of Versailles. The small jewel-like box, to use Linda's term as well, jewel box-like bathroom called a stufetta in the Castel Sant'Angelo is another project probably dating from early in Clement's papacy. The stufetta literally breathes the very essence of antiquity. The decoration has been attributed variously to Giulio Romano, Perino del Vaga, and Giovanni da Udine, certainly the last a plausible attribution that has found favor in recent years. A German visitor to Rome praised the beauty of the paintings and the fanciful ornamentation with stucco seashells. He then, however, condemned the spectacle of the Supreme Pontiff bathing in warm water surrounded by images of nude young women. Oops, such as you saw there a moment ago. Soon after Clement's election, Work began anew at the papal villa on Monte Mario, seen earlier, known today as the Villa Madama. In 1525, Giovanni da Udine decorated the atrium to the garden loggia of the villa with some of his most beautiful stucco work. And as you see here, and I wish to thank Yvonne Alette for these extraordinarily beautiful images that she kindly shared with me. In the mid-1520s, Giovanni da Udine and Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, and these are all members, of course, of Raphael's Fattoria that we heard about. They worked on fountains for the villa, the former, that is Giovanni da Udine, designing the fanciful elephant fountain at your left. In 1526, in fact, a Venetian ambassador reported that one of Clement's chief delights was to chat with engineers about waterworks, and indeed, in 1520, there are a couple of letters about the Villa Madama where Clement, then cardinal, is interested in the waterworks and the cleaning of conduits and that sort of thing. I should also, given the holiday season, mention that a room at the Villa Madama, painted slightly before Giulio de' Medici was elevated to the papacy, features the first turkey depicted in European art. The established painters who figured prominently in the artistic life of Clementine Rome included Sebastiano Luciani, later called Del Piombo, who in January 1525 presented Clement with two paintings, a Head of Christ and the Madonna of the Veil, now in Prague, which you see here at your left. We know that Clement kept one of Sebastiano's presents in his papal bedroom. As mentioned above, Sebastiano had already worked for Giulio de' Medici during his cardinalate, painting the raising of Lazarus for the Cathedral of Narbonne in southern France. Sebastiano, whom contemporaries praise lavishly for his abilities as a portraitist, also painted the likeness of Clement, which has been shown several times in my talk, in which the pontiff is shown beardless and filled with vigor and arguably, perhaps, with arrogance. At the outset of Clement's pontificate, Giulio Romano, as Raphael's heir, had the lion's share of important large-scale commissions, like the completion of the Sala di Costantino. The artist, however, had produced a group of highly erotic drawings that were reproduced in print form by the printmaker Marcantonio Raimondi, along with truly lascivious, scabrous verses by Pietro Aretino. According to Vasari, Giulio Romano left Rome for Mantua just in time to avoid the anger of the Pope, who had Marcantonio imprisoned for his role in the production of the prints known as I Modi. Now, the reasons for this are somewhat more complex than Vasari might indicate. At the right, I show the cut-down fragments preserved of Marcantonio's prints in the British Museum, and these are what I would call the PG-13 rated version. Giulio's departure from Mantua left the field open for recently arrived younger artists like Rosso Fiorentino and Parmigianino, two of whose iconic works of the 1520s I show here, neither of which, however, was commissioned by Clement himself. Indeed, many young painters and sculptors made their way to Rome to seek their fortunes at the outset of Clement's pontificate. Raffaello da Montelupo recalled in a fragmentary autobiography, quote, Pope Adrian died and Clement of the House of Medici was made pontiff, and in Rome it was believed that many works of sculpture and painting would be carried out. In his memoir, the sculptor Baccio Bandinelli describes how he went to Rome to seek Clement's favor, and in his autobiography, the famed goldsmith and sculptor Benvenuto Cellini paints a vivid, sometimes violent picture of the keenly competitive artistic scene in Clementine Rome between 1524 and 1527. Excuse me. In his Life of Parmigianino, Giorgio Vasari narrates the story of the 21-year-old painter's arrival in Rome, presumably in the summer of 1524. Vasari says that Parmigianino came from Parma with two uncles, bringing with him what we might call a portfolio of 3 works, including the Holy Family at your left, now in Madrid, and this circumcision in the Detroit Institute of Arts at your right. Both of these works demonstrate the young man's mastery of a Roman dark manner, or maniera oscura, which we've heard about, as defined by Kathleen Weil-Garris-Brandt, which was then the preferred style in Clement's circle in Rome in the 1520s. The third painting, excuse me, Parmigianino brought to Rome is the famed self-portrait in a convex mirror, now in Vienna. Vasari notes that the young Parmigianino bore the likeness rather of an angel than of a man, and says that it was felt in Rome that in Parmigianino, Raphael, who had died in 1520, had been reborn. Clement VII was known to appreciate novelty, and this painting, which shows the young painter finely dressed with his right hand greatly exaggerated, embodies the sort of capricious expression appreciated by the Pope. In words, it may have been tailor-made to catch his attention. According to Vasari, the pictures were shown to one of Clement's associates, who immediately introduced the painter to the pontiff. Clement is said to have been so pleased with the handsome young man that he showered him with gifts and favors. Vasari's passage reminds us that for young artists like Parmigianino, a contact or sympathetic supporter who could provide an entree into curial circles was an important asset. This observation leads me to a discussion of the dissemination of taste and the emulation of patronage in Clementine Rome. To put this in anthropological terms, if the Pope was, in one scholar's words, perhaps the biggest of all big men, this is anthropological theory, it was an undeniable coup for an individual of lesser status to employ one of the pontiff's favored artists. Patrons introduced artists to their powerful friends at the papal court, and thus exceptionally gifted young men like Parmigianino could, in theory at least, build up a circle of customers. Not only the direct extending of commissions, but also the lending out of artists to others helped to advance careers. And a tightly knit group of patrons with similar tastes could help a given visual language, such as that preferred in Clementine Rome, to flourish. In this stimulating and competitive environment, Parmigianino, Rosso, Perino, and others forged a highly refined style, dubbed in 1977 by the late French art historian André Chastel the Clementine style, a notion that has since been problematized, debated, and redefined by a number of scholars, including Linda Wolk-Simon. But, excuse me. Sophisticated patrons made what John Sherman dubbed the stylish style, with its emphases on virtuosity and refinement, artificiality and exquisite elegance, the preferred artistic vocabulary in Rome during the 1520s. And Perino's recently acquired drawing here at the Met of just a few years later beautifully illustrates these stylistic elements. A style indebted especially to the late Raphael and to aspects of Michelangelo's art, the manner favored by Roman patrons in the first years of Clement's pontificate stressed grace, variety, and an imaginative rather than slavish attitude toward the antique, all of which we see in this gorgeous drawing. In painting, the maniera oscura, or dark manner, reigns supreme. In part as the result of external events, which I'll outline shortly, this Roman style of the 1520s would provide a model for the courtly European maniera or mannerism of the later 16th century in locations ranging from Genoa with Perino to Fontainebleau, even as far as Prague. In April 1524, Clement confirmed his intention to inaugurate a holy year, or Anno Santo, the last celebration having been in 1500 under the Borgia Pope Alexander VI. In anticipation of the throngs of pilgrims the Anno Santo would bring to the Eternal City, Clement and other patrons undertook repairs in numerous Roman churches. On December 24, 1524, the 8th Jubilee year commenced when Clement opened the closed holy door, or Porta Santa of St. Peter's, with a golden hammer, and that's what you see on the screen. The hammer Clement held was the first precious object used to open the door, Alexander VI and his predecessors having used common workmen's tools. Several papal coins were produced for the Jubilee year of 1525. The obverse one seen at your left in a late 17th century book illustration represents Joseph and Mary adoring the Christ child, an appropriate subject to commemorate the Holy Year, which begins on Christmas Eve. The reverse, on the right of the left image, shows the opening of the Porta Santa. And as seen at your right, Giorgio Vasari later depicted the same scene, the opening of the Holy Door in the Sala di Clemente VII, the Hall of Clement VII, in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. Ugo de Carpi's painted frontal for the altar of the Holy Face, or the Volto Santo, in Old St. Peter's, the goal of thousands of pilgrims, was probably prepared for the celebrations of the 1525 Holy Year. This image at your left, in a consciously archaizing style, shows the Sudarium Christi held by St. Veronica, who stands flanked by Saints Peter and Paul. At your right, a drawing attributed to Parmigianino in the Uffizi, closely related to the Ugo de Carpi altar frontal, suggests that the young Parmigianino, who often worked with the printmaker, supplied the design. Why the painting was carried out by Ugo de Carpi is not entirely clear, although the two compositions are very similar. The Parmigianino at your right lacks the iconic and quasi-medieval quality of the painting, which graced the altar of the Holy Face. The most striking difference, in fact, between the drawing and the panel as executed is the treatment of the head of Christ, which in the painting at your left reverts to revered Byzantine prototypes. I believe that this conscious archaism, in effect, perhaps, a rejection of Parmigianino's style, may have been part of the spirit of pre-Tridentine reform that sought to create a more austere, medievalizing image for the papacy in preparation for the influx of the faithful. Calls for reform notwithstanding, the German humanist Jakob Ziegler, writing before the sack of Rome, bitterly denounced Clement's attempts to bleed pilgrims of their riches in a scathing attack on the Pope's avarice. And summing up the Holy Year of 1525 in his diary, the Netherlandish observer Cornelius de Fena painted a grim picture foreshadowing the sack of Rome when he noted, "In Rome, during the Jubilee year, nothing was seen here but weaponry." All in all, however, for the first 2 years of Clement's pontificate, it must have seemed as if the Medicean Golden Age had indeed returned to the Vatican. The artists who congregated in the city soon discovered, however, that Leo X's lavish outlays for art were not to be repeated by his more sober and parsimonious cousin. After the flurry of papal commissions in 1524-25, surprisingly little work came from the Vatican, and the painters and sculptors who had hoped to repeat Raphael's spectacular successes under Julius II and Leo X had to depend on other patrons. To be sure, some commissions came from the Vatican, but some of the best artists, like Perino del Vaga, may not have received any commissions at all from the second Medici Pope, though the drawing at your right, which has been published by Linda Wolk-Simon, may record a never-realized Clementine commission. Clearly, however, after the Jubilee year of 1525, papal support for the arts in Rome was negligible. Thus, despite the convergence of so many talented artists, comparatively little was produced there in the first years of Clement's reign. Instead, it was to Florence and to Michelangelo's new sacristy and the library at San Lorenzo that Clement turned his eyes, and it was there that he devoted his greatest effort as a patron, and I should say as a long-distance patron by letter. Michelangelo himself realized that Clement cared deeply about these projects, and in August 1524 he wrote, and I quote, "This work at San Lorenzo is close to the Pope's heart." The intensity of Clement's feelings for the San Lorenzo projects is seen in your right in the extraordinary postscript, that's down here, of a letter to Michelangelo from Clement written on December 23rd, 1525. In it, Clement, who had always addressed the artist with the formal form of address in Italian, voi, wrote to him instead with the informal tu, which you see right here, and begged him to complete the projects at San Lorenzo. The urgency of the matter is further emphasized by the disparity between the fine chancery hand of the secretary in the upper part of the letter and the scrawl of the pontiff, who signed himself with the initial I for the Latin name Julius. Clement wrote, "You know that popes don't live very long, and we could not desire more than we do to see, or at least to hear, that the chapel with the tombs of our own and also the library will be finished." Having considered the expectations of lavish patronage that drew artists to Rome at Giulio de' Medici's election as Pope Clement VII and the ambience in which they worked, we must now discuss how and why those hopes were destroyed. Shortly after the middle of the decade, it would already have become apparent that the longed-for Medician Golden Age in Rome would not be realized under the second Medici Pope. The reasons for this can be found, in part at least, in the problems that plagued the once brilliant and self-assured Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, problems that would culminate in the disastrous sack of Rome. And again, I show you here is the Pope during the sack. Clement was severely criticized by his contemporaries for indecisiveness and for being too subject to the conflicting political counsel of his two major advisors, one of whom, Giovan Matteo Ghiberti, took a French stand, and that's the person Vasari said introduced him, Parmigianino, to Clement, and the other, Niccolo Schomburg, who supported the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Whereas during his illustrious cardinalate, Giulio de' Medici had been one of Leo's key advisors, successfully treading a path between the empire and France, the same strategy was to prove ill-chosen from the outset of his pontificate. Clement's inherited problems, including the spread of Lutheranism, the loss of roads to the Turks, and the intense rivalry of Francis I and Charles V, made his vacillation perilous for the papacy in a moment when the universal authority of the Church was suffering its greatest challenge. Moreover, Leo X and his ministers had made little effort at long-range financial planning, and Clement inherited his cousin's exorbitant debts. Thus, at the elevation to the papacy, Clement was left with a gravely depleted papal treasury. Clement acquired a reputation for avarice, and he earned the undying hatred of Rome's citizenry for levying new taxes on goods and services. The ever-worsening political situation with Clement caught between the conflicting Christian princes would soon end all hope for concord, and the expectations of artists who had congregated in Rome after the election of the second Medici Pope would soon be dashed because of the political and financial instability of the papacy, which stood on the brink of disaster. The precarious position of the pontiff and the frontispiece to Sigismondo Fanti's Trionfo di Fortuna, or Triumph of Fortune, which you see here. And this is a book of prognostication or fortune-telling dedicated to Clement that was published in January of 1527. The unstable Pope that you see here mirrors the position of Clement himself, the helpless victim of fortune's whim. Given the political and financial conditions of the papacy by early 1527, it should come as no surprise, or by summer of 1526, in fact, it should come as no surprise that Clement's artistic patronage did not live up to the expectations of all those young men who flocked to Rome little more than 2 years before, believing in Raffaello da Montelupo's words that many works of sculpture and painting would be carried out. Still, no one in that summer of 1526 could have predicted that within months Rome would be sacked twice, and that the Pope, who in Pietro Bembo's words would be the greatest and the wisest Pope whom the Church had seen for centuries, would see Rome devastated by imperial troops on May 6th of 1527. Here is not the place to narrate the events of the sack of Rome at length. As seen in the entire version of the print that we've seen here in detail before, the leader of the imperial troops, the Constable Charles de Bourbon, was shot shortly after the onset of the assault. In consequence, troops ran wild through the city. Clement and members of his entourage fled to the Castel Sant'Angelo, as you see at the right, and watched in horror as the city was sacked. Altars were desecrated, relics were stolen and profaned, many thousands died or were tortured, churches and monasteries were plundered, and palaces and houses were looted and burned. Cellini's autobiography provides a vivid, if self-aggrandizing, account of the month-long siege of the Castel Sant'Angelo, claiming to have taken out Bourbon himself. Maybe. In the months after the sack, Roma caput mundi, head of the world, became, in the words of contemporaries, Rome the wretched, Rome the sorrowful. As a result of the sack of Rome, nearly all the artists who had come to Rome at the outset of Clement's pontificate fled the city, taking their maniera romana with them, their modern Roman manner. Polidoro del Caravaggio went to Naples. Rosso Fiorentino went to the court of Francois Ier at Fontainebleau, helping to make the Roman Mannerist style an international phenomenon. Parmigianino went to Bologna and in 1530 returned to his native Parma, and Perino del Vaga, the hero of today's event, worked in Genoa for nearly a decade. Perhaps the most poignant document to convey the impact of the catastrophe is Sebastiano del Piombo's letter of February 24, 1531, which you see here, in which Sebastiano wrote to Michelangelo, and I quote, "I don't feel myself to be the same Sebastiano I was before the sack. I can't go back to that place in my mind." But in but 3.5 years, the great expectations of artists for a new Medician golden age had turned into bitter, shattered dreams. In the time remaining to me, I would like to outline briefly what happened after the sack of Rome. Clement remained captive in the Castel Sant'Angelo until he was freed in December 1527, having promised a huge indemnity to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, seen at your right. The Pope fled immediately after his release from Castel Sant'Angelo to the city of Orvieto, and then in June of 1528 moved to Viterbo, returning to Rome only in October of that year, so he was gone well over a year. Upon his return, Clement found the city in a ruinous state. On October 24, 1528, he wrote to the emperor, with whom he sought reconciliation, describing Rome as a pitiable and mangled corpse. Clement's immediate concerns were with repairing damage and restoring a degree of normalcy in institutions. In the spring of 1529, the Pope, who had fallen gravely ill, reconciled with the emperor, forming an alliance formalized in the Treaty of Barcelona. In the autumn of 1529, the Pope and the Emperor traveled to Bologna, each making splendid ceremonial entries with carefully calculated political messages. Sebastiano del Piombo accompanied Clement, and the drawing you see here at the left, possibly a modello for a larger work, perhaps a fresco or a tapestry, represents the Pontiff and Charles in Bologna, and notice Clement's gesture instructing the Holy Roman Emperor, whose vassal, in effect, the Pope had become. On February 24th of 1530, Clement crowned Charles emperor in a Bolognese church that had been refashioned to resemble St. Peter's in Rome. The splendid events were recounted, commemorated in various media, including maiolica, medals, and prints. And here I show you a hand collar detail from a famous series of prints by Nicholas Hogenberg at the right hand of the screen. Necessarily, the scope and character of Clement's patronage of art changed after the sack of Rome. Following his return to Rome and reconciliation with Charles V, there was, in fact, a noteworthy revival of papal patronage. One of the first concerns was providing liturgical objects for celebrating the Mass and other ecclesiastic occasions. Some of the artists whom Clement had employed during his cardinalate and during his pontificate prior to the sack returned and continued to work for him. In 1531, Giovanni da Udine restored the apse mosaics of Old St. Peter's. He then was sent to Florence to work in the new sacristy. In autumn of that year, 1531, Clement appointed the loyal Sebastiano his papal bullarum plumator, or a fixer of papal seals. Afterwards, the painter would be known as Sebastiano del Piombo, or of the lead seal. Sebastiano's portrait of Clement at the left in the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, painted on slate in sumptuous Venetian colors, evokes Raphael's portrait of Julius II and probably dates to 1532. The Pope, that is Clement, grew his beard to signify mourning for the sack of Rome. Sebastiano's sober and restrained image of Clement at your left is remarkably different from the painter's dramatic, even arrogant characterization of but a few years before. The differences in the Pope's appearance and demeanor speak volumes about the impact of the sack of Rome on the once proud Medici pontiff. Some of the most beautiful and innovative medals and coins of the Renaissance were produced for Clement in the years following the sack of Rome. Many of them carry inscriptions alluding to the disaster that had befallen the papacy. One shows Clement, Freudian slip there. One shows Christ at the column, framed by the words, "They endure after many tears," a clear allusion to Clement's terrible suffering during the sack. In the spring of 1529, Benvenuto Cellini was appointed papal master of dyes at the Zecca, the papal mint. His relationship with Clement, recounted in his autobiography, was sometimes fraught with tension. In 1534, Cellini designed two beautiful gilt silver medals for Clement at his own initiative, that is Cellini's initiative, that share the same obverse with a portrait of the bearded Pope, as you see at your left. The reverse of one, seen here at the right, shows a personification of peace, seen over here, putting to the torch a pile of weapons. The inscription reads, "The gates of war are closed," alluding to the re-establishment of peace in the years after the sack of Rome. After the sack, Clement commissioned Cellini to make a spectacular gem-studded golden morse or clasp for the papal cope, which is a kind of cape, basically, which is no longer extant. It's known through these watercolor drawings that you see here. Cellini's accounts of this commission demonstrate Clement's participation in the design process. Valerio Belli, who had done that beautiful crucifix for Clement in 1524, continued to work for Clement after the sack, and between 1530 and 32, Valerio produced his most famous work, this beautiful rock crystal casket with scenes from the life of Christ. On the occasion of the marriage of his niece Catherine de' Medici to the son of Francis I in Marseille, Clement presented this splendid work, originally made for a liturgical purpose, to the French king. At the same time, let's see if we can get that back. At the same time, as you see here, Clement also presented Francois Premier with a unicorn horn, actually a narwhal horn, in a mount fashioned by Cellini, and Cellini talks about that at some length in his autobiography. In Rome, a major focus of Clement's attention as patron was the Castel Sant'Angelo, where he and his retinue had spent 7 harrowing months in 1527. According to Vasari, while captive in Castel Sant'Angelo, Clement vowed to place a sculptural group representing St. Michael's triumph over the 7 deadly sins on top of the papal stronghold that had sheltered him. Vasari says that Clement approved a design by Baccio Bandinelli, who began working on clay models for casting. A drawing in the Louvre at your right preserves Bandinelli's ideas for that group, which was, however, never realized. In André Chastel's words, the St. Michael group would have served, quote, as a sort of emblematic image of divine protection of the Holy See, end quote. After the sack of Rome, Clement's projects at San Lorenzo and Florence remained of paramount concern. Indeed, even while exiled from Rome, with his resources depleted, Clement wanted to know if Michelangelo was at work for him in Florence. But Michelangelo had sided with the anti-Medici and last Florentine Republic and worked on designs to fortify the city against the papal imperial alliance. Following the surrender of the Republic in 1530, after a siege by imperial troops, Michelangelo was deemed a traitor by the new Medici regime, and only Clement's pardon saved the artist's life for another 30-some years of artistic production. Following his reconciliation with the Pope, Michelangelo returned to the new sacristy and Laurentian library, but relatively little was accomplished before the pontiff's death. Clement's greatest act as patron in Rome after the sack was the commission he extended to Michelangelo late in 1533 or early in 1534 to paint the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, as you see at the left, with a Last Judgment. But Clement, ever the victim of fortune, who so spurned him, died on September 25, 1534, and would never see the work intended for him to leave his mark as papal patron on the most sacred chapel in Christendom, which of course had frescoes by Michelangelo for Julius II, Raphael's tapestries and paintings in the 15th century as well. As early as 1520, Giulio de' Medici wanted to be buried in Michelangelo's new sacristy in Florence. This would not happen. The Met is, in fact, fortunate to have a later plan, which you see at your right, for Clement's tomb by Antonio da San Gallo the Younger, which is datable to about 1530 to 35, perhaps actually after the Pope's death, and intended for a Roman rather than Florentine setting. Eventually, Clement would be entombed in Rome, in Santa Maria sopra Minerva, in a wall tomb designed by Baccio Bandinelli, across the choir from the tomb of his beloved cousin, Pope Leo X. In a 1534 funeral oration for Clement VII, the eulogist Lorenzo Grana praised the Medici family for its critical role in the revival of Greek and Latin letters and of all the arts. The recently deceased pontiff, by implication, was a paradigmatic exemplar of Medici support for the arts. Excuse me. Grana also claimed that Clement deserved to be counted among the greatest of popes. History, of course, has not concurred with that assertion. Nonetheless, despite the shattered dreams of the many artists who came to Rome at the outset of his pontificate, Giulio de' Medici, as cardinal and as pope, is without question one of the most significant and fascinating of all Renaissance patrons. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda and Sheryl, for giving us that wonderful glimpse into the decade when Perino set out in Rome. We were able to bid at auction on the Perino Holy Family only because Michael Gallagher, the head of our paintings conservation department, had looked carefully at the painting and believed that with conservation it would emerge intact from under the centuries of grime and discoloration in which we were seeing it. But I won't tell you his story. I'll tell you that just now. Michael has been the Sherman Fairchild Conservator in charge of paintings conservation since 2005, having previously been Keeper of Conservation at the National Galleries of Scotland and Conservator at the Gemälde Gallery Berlin and the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth. His degree is from the Hamilton Care Institute of the University of Cambridge. Since arriving at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Michael has worked on a series of conservation projects that have made us better able to see and appreciate some of New York's most important and beloved paintings, including 3 portraits by Velázquez, one from the Frick collection. He has fostered an atmosphere of study and dialogue in the conservation studio that has greatly benefited the curatorial staff here and at other New York museums, and led to wonderful collaborations, such as that resulting in the presentation of the Perino Holy Family in the Burlington Magazine, in which Michael's analysis of the painting and its restoration appeared alongside Linda Wolk-Simon's historical discussion. Today, Michael's talk will be Emerging from the Shadows, the Conservation of the Holy Family with the Infant St. John the Baptist. Please welcome Michael Gallagher.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming today on a beautiful December day and spend the afternoon with us. I'd like to thank Andrea for a very kind introduction. You may guess that my title came to me after I read Linda's title. And in a sense, the Emerging from the Shadows was with the idea of saying a little to you about this painting by Perino, which I think makes him stand as an artist in his own right, and also in the sense that it was a picture that was so incredibly obscured by discolored varnish and overpainting that the picture itself emerged from the shadows. I was first made aware of the painting when Keith Christiansen, who is our chair of European paintings, sent round a JPEG and was very excited about it. I am certainly not a Perino specialist, but I was very impressed by what I saw in that image. Shortly afterwards, this was in October 2010, Linda Wolk-Simon, Andrea Baer, and I went down to Sotheby's to look at the painting. This is actually the picture that was taken here in the Metropolitan Museum when the picture arrived, but this is pretty much what we saw. Around the edges, this is later wooden strips that were put on, just nailed into the original panel to help facilitate framing. But we were really, frankly, I think, blown away by the picture. What impressed me was the sense that there was something in this picture that was waiting to be discovered. Very, very few pictures come down to us in this sort of what appeared to be the condition under all these obscuring layers of varnish. Sotheby's, I think, in a short film they did running up to the sales, I think referred to the picture as pristine, which I said later it's as pristine as I'm 21, but it is in remarkable condition, but it is not pristine. Pristine would imply that nothing had ever happened to it, no damage, no problems, and this was not the case. This is a detail from the upper left. You can see something, probably an old scrape from removing the picture from a frame or something like that, dragged and removed paint in this area. That was overpainted. That overpaint was under the varnish. Similarly, down a little lower, the same sort of thing, probably perhaps on the same occasion when it was roughly pulled from a frame, another large scratch, again, overpainted under the layers of varnish that we see. However, that aside, what struck us as so compelling was this sense that the more delicate tonal ranges of the flesh tones, which can so easily be damaged in harsh cleaning in the past, appeared to be entirely intact. The varnish was fogged and blanched. Sorry, didn't mean to jump ahead there. You can sort of see here this sort of milky quality. Little stains and accretions on the surface, and obviously very yellow. And what we always say when we talk about the cleaning or the removal of discolored varnish from a work of art is that sort of varnish does two things. It shifts the color balance because it's got a distinct color itself. It's a yellow-brown. But it also completely distorts the tonality. It actually compresses the tonality. Lights get darker and the darks curiously get lighter. Because it's a crystalline, oxidized layer, the analogy I always give is sort of like dust on a black surface. When you draw your finger through it, it's darker. The varnish scatters the light. So the deepest shadows appear lighter than they ought to. Here in the Christ child's leg, you see these stains probably from lime wash or something dripping onto the painting during some decoration. We see this quite a lot, but that it's slightly sort of etched into the surface. So again, not pristine, but really still very, very remarkable. During that relatively short examination of the picture that Linda and Andrea and I undertook, one of the things that struck me fairly early on was a sort of growing suspicion that all was not well with the drapery of the Virgin. when you look at the wonderful command of form, even under these varnish layers in the rest of the picture, and then you suddenly get to this formless robe, it immediately raises questions. And as I looked at it more carefully, I became convinced that that was in fact overpaint. Perino had decorated the edge of the veil with this wonderful sort of filigree of shell gold. That's a sort of gold powder, usually ground in something like gum arabic. Here the Stella Maris on the side, but here wonderfully carried down the edge of the veil. And this very leathery-looking layer of paint, as you can see, was very crudely around the edges here, sort of brought up to the edges along here. And that was my biggest concern about the condition. But as I think Linda so eloquently explained earlier, the rarity of this picture shifted that risk about the doubt to a different place. This was a picture that we felt that the museum was compelled to try and acquire. It would be an extraordinary addition to the collections. And so, though I couldn't be 100% sure whether at that time, both whether it was later, and if it was later, whether I could remove it, we felt confident enough to recommend to the trustees that we should try and acquire this picture at the forthcoming sale. And I'm very happy to say we were able to acquire it, along with the splendid drawing. That's just another detail of this underlayer that seems to be this greenish underlay showing through there by the head of the Baptist prior to cleaning. You can see it here. So when the painting was acquired, after careful examination in the studio, I began the process of removing the varnish. And I have to say, on a picture that is preserved like this, it would be a lie to pretend it's anything other than a privilege, really. This initial part of the cleaning was very straightforward. The varnish was very easily soluble. And I took a sequence because it was such a sort of a beautiful transformation, I think, as this layer just came away quite easily of a varnish that was probably applied in, I think, at the latter part of the 19th century, the early 20th century, certainly not an original varnish. And in a moment you'll see this little speck be removed. And this, I mean, just sensational paint layer. Keith and Andrea and Linda were up on an almost daily basis during the process. So compelling was that change. However, that obviously, more importantly, was what would happen with the drapery. And once, I mean, in a sense, before the varnish removal was undertaken, I already had a very clear sense of the status of this overpaint. It was definitely overpaint. And one of the things that immediately jumped to mind was, why would anyone overpaint this robe? One possible scenario was that the robe was so incredibly damaged that somebody had just taken the liberty of covering it over. But the rest of the painting seemed to be in amazing condition, so why would that be the case? And so, as part of the examination, an X-ray of the painting was taken, and X-radiography on paintings is very similar to the type of X-radiography that is done on you and I. The materials of the picture block the X-ray from exposing the film. The use of lead white in paintings particularly blocks the X-ray, and so areas that are light or white often appear light or white in the X-ray, whereas absence of material or material that have a lower atomic weight, pigments and so on, will allow the X-ray through to darken. So just to explain, this is where there are two but the painting is on quite a thick piece of poplar, and there were two cross battens originally in the back, and these were taken out during the course of treatment to sort of facilitate the picture sitting comfortably on the easel. They were replaced later, but that's why you get these two dark lines. But more interestingly, for what we're talking about, is if you see these little black dots here or this here, they correspond to paint losses, actual flake losses in the picture. So if the drapery of the Virgin had been very damaged, and that was the reason for the overpainting, this whole area would have been peppered with that type of loss. And instead, what we saw was this whole set of folds gathering around the elbow and across to the wrist, arm and wrist of the Virgin. With this in mind, this sort of evidence in mind, with cleaning tests, the decision was made to go ahead and proceed with the removal of that overpaint. It was a tenacious layer. I think it was probably put on within 100 years, I would guess, of the picture being completed. It's a layer of two blue pigments, azurite and smalt, both what we would regard as sort of historic pigments, not something you would be using in the 19th century or. But the smalt, which is a cobalt glass, often catalyzes degradation of the oil medium. And so this blackish appearance was actually the fact that the oil in that paint had become incredibly brown and discolored. And so you get a sort of absorption across the spectrum of these blue pigments and then brown. I think when it was probably first put on, it was to a degree translucent and blue, and the folds would have probably shown through to some degree. But I think the evidence suggests that it was a purely aesthetic decision to suppress the very idiosyncratic colouring, very what later we would think of as sort of Mannerist colouring of this sort of aqua. It's not a traditional clear blue that you would get with something like ultramarine. It is a very sort of aqua tone. So this is just further removal of that layer. And you see the folds here that correspond in the X-ray. And that's just of those two the details of those two images you just saw. And under this layer, and in a sense what allowed it to be removed, was quite a thick, oily layer of an earlier varnish that I can't quite see myself whether it's possible for you in the audience to see, but this has this sort of very, very dark brown patination that needed to be thinned at a later state. So from here, with the partial removal of the overpaint, still some discolored varnish in place here, we move to the painting after the overpaint and the varnish has been removed, and also I have filled the little losses that you see around the edges. The filling is a material just brings those losses up to the same level as the surrounding paint. And I think the key thing to notice is how little damage there is. Very minor scrapes in the background, around the edges, and then just the odd little tiny loss. So really a picture in remarkable condition. The next stage after the cleaning is to reintegrate the losses, and that we do by retouching. The aim of the retouching is to suppress the damage so that when you see the picture, it is the original that draws your attention, not distracting damage. The retouching is undertaken above an isolating layer of varnish. It's not done with the same materials of the painting, so it's actually, the bulk of it is water-based, and then the last glazing is a synthetic medium that is very easily soluble. So in the future, if anyone wants to remove that restoration, they can do so very, very easily without affecting the original beneath. And PowerPoint presentations, I always drive me nuts because they take a lot longer than when we used to have slides and you just drop your slides in. But the one great thing about PowerPoint are things like this. which I did on my computer about 15 times, just watching it over and over again. And I think what you see emerge there is just this extraordinary elegance of handling. The details like the braid and the whole way this light articulates the face. And again, I want to emphasize that when you go from the after cleaning to the after restoration, how little has needed to be done. The picture is in extraordinary condition. And I have another sequence with the head of Joseph. These wonderful hands. And finally with the Christ Child, which on that October day in Sotheby's we all completely fell in love with. After cleaning, I think one of the many things that struck us was how the light that had been sort of returned, not just the color, which people always talk about the color, but the light that had returned to the picture, which completely articulated the space in a different way. It sort of united Joseph, who is in the shadows but is now seems to be much more involved in the composition, and it makes sense of the strong side lighting on the Virgin's face, on the Christ Child, and so on, and then this wonderful interplay of shadows that is seen throughout. And I think when you look at the drawings in the exhibition upstairs, this is an early drawing that I think Linda says is around about 1521. And it's one of the things that struck me was, yes, lots of people in Raphael's circle use light and shade to articulate, but this very, very, I almost found it kind of fearless, blocky chiaroscuro, this play of light and dark, to both create form and a sort of dynamic in the drawing. I find in a relatively, I'm an amateur where it comes to Perino, but it struck me as very characteristic. If you go and you look at the way this incredible shift from light and dark, and this is, a couple of people asked me afterwards, is there overpaint still on this? And no, that has been removed. This very, very strong contrast is original conception, but the strong shadows across here, the way the Baptist's head is in shadow against these beautiful colors of the Virgin's sleeve and robe. And again, the way Joseph's head falls into shadow, or here behind the Christ Child. I think there are echoes of that in these very, very strong and, as I say, fearless use of shadow to create form and drama. Another thing that Linda drew my attention to in the same drawing are these wonderful use of white heightening, this sort of filigree line that seems to find such an echo in the treatment of the veil, the halo and the veil here. Very, very delicate. And of course, it's always slightly obscene when you blow up these details. The drawing is literally about this size. But that ability to both to apply it and also the sort of sensibility in response to the sort of potential for that kind of elegant finishing touch seems to be so in harmony between the drawings and the painting. And again, you see that, I mean, this is again a tiny detail just beneath the collar of the Virgin here. This treatment of the feathers and just done with this lightest of touches. The painting is actually, it's simple in its, it's four figures, but it's actually complicated in terms of a composition. The placement seems very, very thought through, the sort of overlapping forms, the complexity, this fabulous sort of combination of artifice and then naturalism, this observation of fabrics, of skin, of detail. It needed planning. It's constructed, the picture is constructed, as I say, on a poplar panel with a gesso ground. And so the question is then, how was the composition planned? How was it? Was it planned on the panel? Was it transferred to the panel? And this became one of the sort of vexing questions. And I'll warn you now, there isn't really a straight answer to this at the end, but it is, and it certainly, we found it a very interesting conundrum. There are hardly any changes. This is an image in infrared. That is the technique we use to examine underdrawing. We can usually image carbon-based underdrawing. So where Perino used black in the paint layer, it registers very strongly. So you get an image that is almost looks like a black and white image of the of just the original painting. But what we were looking for was evidence of drawing, and we didn't immediately see that. What you saw was there were two changes, and that's all. In the head of the Christ child, which was slightly enlarged, which I'm just going to emphasize there, and in the leg, which was slightly reduced, which you'll see there, and you might even be able to see that with the naked eye. Clearly, when something is so elegantly conceived, you're not just sort of painting this, popping up your panel and starting. There is a lot of careful planning. And as Linda was explaining earlier, that disegno and invenzione were sort of two cornerstones of Raphael and the generation he worked with and mentored, and Perino being an exemplar of that. One of the problems, as has already been outlined, is there are so few works to call on to sort of see what is the norm. But these are two very extreme examples. This painting, Holy Family with St. John the Baptist, is in the Courtauld Institute in London. Clearly it's an unfinished painting. Also, I think Linda gives this an early 1520s date. There is a lot of discussion, as I have discovered. Perino has also now become a household name in my house, but thanks to Linda. But I think I find this very easy to believe that this is very early in the 1520s. This is much, much later. This is in the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne. And they're very completely different in the construction in terms of laying out composition. The Courtauld picture, as I say, is unfinished. It's still a very, very compelling picture. And a lot of it is done with this wonderful, very accomplished pen and ink line. It's been questioned whether when something is as straight as that, is there some sort of mechanical transfer? I think it may be just simply that it's a very assured straight line. But you see this type of, possibly that could have been done from working from a drawing, but very, very assured, no real changes. And then in the sleeve, this wonderful sort of fluid calligraphic touch that is so similar to sort of drawings of the same period. And when you put those together, I think it's a very compelling comparison of that sort of freedom, that wonderful draftsmanship that Linda mentioned earlier. This is the infrared image of the Courtauld's Holy Family. And what you'll see is some of the lines seem to drop away because the material that was used for the underdrawing is not something that is necessarily imaged with infrared. As I say, we normally get the strongest image from carbon-based materials. What is interesting in this picture is that, if I just move forward, as well as there's the composition you see, which for whatever reason was abandoned with its ink lines, there's also, we don't know whether it was a plan for an earlier composition or whether the artist was in a sense doodling, planning with the panel he had, but you can see this tree form here, and this is done with a charcoal base, that's why it's clearer. And it's much more difficult to see, but in magnification there are a group of figures here. What can't be imaged with infrared are the traces of red chalk, which are also on the panel. So in one panel, you have pen and ink drawing, you have charcoal drawing, you saw probably the washes, and then you have red chalk. The Melbourne picture, very, very, very different time, much more mannerist, this sort of metallic colouring, is completely different again. And what this has is the most incredible pounced drawing. Pouncing was the process when a drawing was made, a preparatory drawing, a cartoon. It could be using a needle or something. You could punch little holes all along the lines, and then you could take your sheet of paper, lay it on whatever surface you're going to do the painting, and with something like a little bag of charcoal dust, tamp it the dust through the holes on the drawing, and it would leave a little dot on the surface to be painted. That could later, those dots could be joined up with a liquid medium later, and hey presto, you've got your drawing there. I always imagined that it was the type of job you would give to your young assistant, while I go out for lunch, put in 4,000 pinpricks into this drawing. But this one is a real, is an amazing picture. I did this fade to the infrared because it is so compelling. And I'll show you a detail in a moment, but from a distance, this may look like a continuous line, but in fact, it's a completely manic set of dots for every single curl, all around the ear, the inside of the ear. And one of the reasons I think that these things were done by assistant is that Perino didn't need to have the inside line of the ear marked, but you could imagine it was, as an assistant, you wouldn't want to miss any line at all. And this, even on the surface, you can see some of that showing through, but when I go to the infrared image of that, it's even more striking. Every little fold, every detail. As I say, we didn't have that in our painting. When we looked at the picture in infrared, we couldn't find black dots from something like a carbon being pounced through a cartoon. What we did have, though, was evidence of pouncing, and it's very difficult to see. If you look in, let me see, particularly from here because I can't see them, but can you see these little white dots that are running up here? Throughout the painting, we kept finding these tiny little, in infrared, little white dots, not the black dots you would think. And there's some along here, these little, what here now appear black, and some there. There's a nice little group there along that contour. Under magnification, these turned out to be tiny little losses. So these are the ones that describe the foot. You see a line of them here. You see a line of around the toe, that toe, so on. And when I go to the X-radiograph and the infrared comparison, I'll talk about the infrared first because they're white. They're not the black I talked about. In the X-ray, those same little dots appear black, and that's because there's a little paint loss, and the absence of material allows the X-ray to expose the plate more in there, so they appear like little black dots. Whereas in the infrared, the absence of material is allowing the gesso to reflect back, and they appear white. However, when you look at these under magnification, these little black dots, they're not actually black at all. They're a paint loss, and they weren't pricked. These losses have occurred when the paint has become aged and embrittled. That's why you get this sort of fracture that like almost like something glassy breaking. But what you see, and that's from this area here, is a brown layer. And that's a detail of that, a brown paint layer that lies beneath. This is where, in a sense, our investigation sort of came up against a bit of a brick wall. Logic would tell you that there was a couple of ways of going about laying in a composition. You could have your wonderful white gesso, you could pounce through a design, draw it up with a line, and then if you wanted to put a brown undermodeling on, you would follow that design. However, that would mean that whatever you pounced with would be directly on the gesso. So when it caused the paint to ping off, what you would expect there was to see the gesso. So that couldn't be the case. So then the other question was, well, is this brown layer over the entire picture as a sort of second ground, as what we'd call an imprimatura? When the picture was further examined, that was not the case. The brown layer is not under the green. There's a grey underlayer in the greens. And also in cross-section, that's when we take a tiny sample from around a damage, about the size of a salt grain. You could see that it was very brushy. In some places it was thinner than others, in some places it was thicker. So it did seem to be the role of an undermodeling. So what I found confusing was you can't have an undermodeling without first having a design that you are modeling, you're applying light and shade to. So was this pouncing a second stage? Was maybe the first stage of the drawing something we can't image, and then Perino revised and used a different sort of material to pounce through, which caused the paint layer in places to come off? Is that why we don't see these losses absolutely everywhere? I'm sorry to say the answer is I don't know. I discussed this a great deal with many colleagues, but I think what is clear is there was at some point a mechanical transfer of a design, and that the brown layer underneath plays an important role in the build-up of the painting and its tonality. This is a little loss which may be just, it could be linked with that same process, or it could be a loss of its own, but by the Virgin's eye, and you see the brown layer there. And this layer really, it's different, but it did make me think of the Courtauld picture. And when you look at this blocking in of the shadow, and that's the start of the Christ child's hair, or the Virgin's hair here, perhaps this was the type of undermodeling that is taking place beneath our painting. Certainly, it plays a really vital role in establishing the tonality and the modeling. As I say, it's not under this. This was actually behind here. You can't see it now because it's changed so much. There was a green drapery. The green is copper-based. It's gone very brown over time. That's an irreversible change. And you need it in a very strong light to see the shadows now that run across horizontally. But this was a very heavy green background. But under that is a grey layer. But elsewhere, the brown is really crucial. These sensational details where this looks so Raphaelesque, but these tones are partly as a result of this underpainting. When you have a dark brown layer and you pass over it a very thin pinkish, whitish pink layer, what you get is a sort of optical grey, because the pale pink isn't completely opaque. The brown pulls through it slightly, and you get what we call an optical grey. You see it in the Virgin's face, but you see it particularly in the Christ child, particularly in the Christ child's chest. But many of these tones here are actually a sort of absence of further additional layers of the flesh tone. Because once you had your brown undermodeling layer, and if you think back to the Courtauld at that intermediary stage, and then you began to add the flesh tones, and then as you added another layer of flesh tone, it would be pinker. It would be you could sort of pull up and out the form in that way. And this is a tiny sample that was taken from a loss in the Christ child's chest. This is the gesso layer. And then this is the brown layer, a mixture of umber, a little lead white, and a little calcite. And you sort of see the brushiness. In places it goes much thicker than that. In other places it's less. And then the flesh tone on top, which interesting, has little particles of blue in it. But that is the role being played. And in this detail taken under the microscope, where the paint layer is a little worn, what appears to be a grey is actually just a thin layer of the flesh tone over that brown, which is giving that grey appearance. Fantastic little use here of both the absence of a pink layer on top, the brown showing through, and then a little additive, more brown paint to articulate the mouth. So you can see this almost a slight patchiness in the grey there, where because paint as it ages becomes more transparent, that effect can sometimes shift and become a little more exaggerated. The following slides, as I just draw to a close, really, are just pure indulgence, actually. I won't pretend anything else. I was sort of trying to hang something profound to say around these, but there isn't much. But I think it just emphasizes, frankly, and it sounds a little bit self-congratulatory on the part of the museum, but what a coup it was to get a painting like this. We found out later that the underbidders for this painting was the Louvre, who were not short of a good picture or two, and it was very gratifying because it's very difficult for the museum to bid at auction. It's something the trustees are sometimes uneasy with, because it is a bit of a roulette wheel in terms of fortunes. And also we don't have as deep a pocket as many private individuals. So it really felt like something very special when we were able to acquire this. I think some of those things I was just to reiterate this sort of fantastic use of the shadow and the sort of stepping back in space. A couple of people found Joseph rather, I think the term was creepy. I don't at all. I think he's actually has a very benevolent quality. One of the things that is so compelling about the painting is the fact that Joseph and the Virgin look out at us, and the Christ child and the Baptist do not. The Christ child actually seems wrapped up in his own thoughts. The Baptist is in adoration of the Christ child. But there's something very compelling about us being drawn into their foreknowledge of the little child who sits in the bottom right corner. And I think it makes the picture incredibly engaging. The Virgin's face, I mean, this wonderful sort of liquid touch of the highlight, very stylized and impossibly elegant. And then the Christ child, which, as Linda has said, we all wondered whether it was based on Perino's own child, because it does seem to be drawn from very close observation of a real baby, those slightly roomy eyes, the nose and so on. It's just really beautiful. I think also Linda wondered whether Giovanni de Udine could have been involved in the creation of the goldfinch there. This sort of slight watery touch, and the pink pulled over the eyelids, these wonderful blonde strands in the eyebrows, and again this moving into the sort of into the shadow by using less of the flesh tone over that underlayer. And then one of my favorite details in the entire picture, I think it's almost like the sort of emotional heart of the picture. Christ takes the sort of cherry, which, as Linda describes in her article, is a sort of symbol of the forbidden fruit that was taken in the Garden of Eden, as Christ takes on the sort of original sin. But there's something also so incredibly tender in terms of a mother and child, the way those fingers, his finger interlocks with hers, and the play of shadows across the two embracing hands is I think, quite heartbreaking, actually. And I hope when you have a little time when this is over. You will go again and look at the picture. We're thrilled to have it here in the collection. I think seeing that opposite the drawing was a tremendously exciting for us. So I do hope you'll go and see it. As well as the thanks I give here, I think on behalf of all of us, like to thank the team who are behind these doors, who from the education department, who always make these things run incredibly smoothly and are unbelievably accommodating. Thank you very much.